So a Twitter battle broke out yesterday that's representative of this emerging dysfunction of the brand new 117th Congress. It started with a tweet from AOC about the GameStop situation that's dominated the news this week. She said, "This is unacceptable. We now need to know more about @Robinhood app's decision to block retail investors from purchasing stock while hedge funds are freely able to trade the stock as they see fit. As a member of the Financial Services Committee, I'd support a hearing if necessary." And so, like the nerd coming up to the cool kids table at lunch in the cafeteria, Ted Cruz jumps in and says, "Fully agree," with a downward pointy emoticon. So AOC was not impressed by that action. So she tweeted, "I'm happy to work with Republicans on this issue where there's common ground, but you almost had me murdered 3 weeks ago, so you can sit this one out. Happy to work with almost any other GOP that aren't trying to get me killed. In the meantime, if you want to help, you can resign." So, as they said in Anchorman, that escalated quickly. So Ted Cruz didn't tweet, but he was quoted in response saying, "You know, there's a lot of partisan anger and rage on the Democratic side. It's not healthy for our country, and it's certainly not conducive of healing or unity. But everyone has to decide how they want to interact with others." So again, he's going all high ground on it. And AOC says, "Oh, there's anger? Now, why would there be anger that Cruz amplified known lies about our election that fueled an insurrection that cost people's lives? What does he think the logical response to his lies should be? A hug? Maybe there's anger because," and I highlighted this part, "his actions deserve accountability." So keep the word accountability in mind here. Now, in response to AOC's original tweet, one of her congressional colleagues, a Republican from Texas, the 21st district, which is basically San Antonio, Chip Roy, wrote a letter on his official letterhead to House Speaker Pelosi. And it says, "Dear Speaker Pelosi, it has come to my attention that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sent out a tweet a few hours ago in which she accused Senator Ted Cruz, in essence, of attempted murder. As a member of this body who disagreed with, quote-unquote, objections to the electors and who has expressed publicly my concerns about the events leading to January 6th, it is completely unacceptable behavior for a member of Congress to make this kind of scurrilous charge against another member of the House or Senate for simply engaging in speech and debate regarding electors as they interpreted the Constitution. I ask you to call on her to immediately apologize if you retract her and retract her comments. If Representative Ocasio-Cortez does not apologize immediately, we will be forced to find alternative means to condemn this regrettable statement." Signed, sincerely, Chip Roy. So we're talking about alternative means to condemn. We're talking about demands for accountability. So what are the mechanisms that are available to our representatives and senators? Well, there's basically three. And we've heard these words thrown around in passing since the insurrection. So let's run them to ground a little bit here. So basically, the highest form of accountability and consequences for bad actors in the House or Senate is expulsion. They can get expelled. Then there is censure. And then the lowest one is just called a reprimand. So let's look back at the history of the House and the Senate across American history and see how this has played out. And we'll get some sort of benchmarks for what is potentially in play for the folks who are being accused of certain things these days. So let's start with the House. So in the history of the House, 5 congressmen have been expelled. 4 of those were for throwing their support to the South at the outset of the Civil War. And then the last guy to get expelled was in 2002, a Democrat from Ohio, James Traficant, for bribery, corruption, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, and racketeering. Now, on the censure side, there have been 23 congressmen in the history of the United States who have been censured for all kinds of different things. Starting with, in 1832, William Stanberry of Ohio was censured for insulting the Speaker of the House. And then there have been making statements in support of the Confederate Rebellion, not joining the Confederate Rebellion, but making statements in support of, was worthy in 1864 of censure. Insulting the House with a resolution containing unparliamentary language, assaulting a representative on the floor of the House, selling military academy appointments. That's an interesting one. That happened in 1870. And then most recently, there's been improper use of campaign funds, engaging in sexual conduct with a House page. And then in 2010, the last censure was Charles Rangel, a Democrat from New York, for improper solicitation of funds, making inaccurate financial disclosure statements, and failure to pay taxes. So that's the House side. On the Senate side, there have been 15 senators in the history of the United States who've been expelled. Starting in 1797, William Blount, who was a Democratic Republican. Remember when we were talking about the election of 1800 and Thomas Jefferson? Several episodes ago, the parties at that time were Federalist and Democratic Republican. So he was a Democratic Republican from Tennessee, and the reason he was expelled was treason. We'll talk about the definition of treason in a few seconds here. And then everybody else of the 15, 14 of these senators were for supporting and joining the South during the outset of the Civil War. So there hasn't been a senator expelled since 1862. Now, there have been a number of expulsion proceedings that were started, but ultimately the senator was not expelled. And so there's actually been 17 of those cases. And the reasons they weren't expelled were they resigned before they could be expelled, or in one case in 1905, John Mitchell died during the proceedings. He was charged with corruption. So these proceedings were started because of things like corruption, embezzlement. In 1907, Reed Smoot the expulsion proceedings were started because he was a Mormon, and that was called a religion incompatible with U.S. law, but ultimately that was found not to be a justified reason for expelling a senator. 1919, Robert Follett, charged with disloyalty for a speech opposing the entry into World War I. And then this is an interesting one in these days of mega million campaigns. 1922, Truman Handy Newberry was convicted of election fraud, which was overturned, and for excessive spending in a primary. Interesting. But remember, he was not expelled. And then on the censure side, there have been 9 senators censured. Starting in 1811, Tim Pickering, who was a Federalist, was censured for reading confidential documents in open Senate session. 1902, Benjamin Tillman and John McLaurin were censured for fighting on the Senate floor. 1954, Joseph McCarthy, the infamous McCarthy of the McCarthy hearings, Red Scare, was censured. He's a Republican from Wisconsin, censured for verbal abuse of the Select Committee to Study Censure. So that's ironic. You get censured during the Committee to Study Censure. And then the last senator censured was in 1990, David Durenberger, Republican from Minnesota, for unethical conduct relating to reimbursement of Senate expenses and acceptance of outside payments and gifts. So that's the history of expulsion and censure. Now you can look up reprimands, because there have been some interesting ones, including Newt Gingrich was reprimanded for misuse of campaign funds. But let's talk about the current state of play with respect to this sort of accountability. So we've heard the word treason thrown out, and we've heard the word sedition thrown out. So let's talk about the U.S. Code definitions of both of those. Okay, so here's U.S. Code 2381, which is treason. It's a pretty high bar. So whoever owing allegiance to the United States levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, is guilty of treason and shall suffer death or shall be imprisoned not less than 5 years and fined under this title but not less than $10,000 and shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. So that was last modified in 1994. And then on the sedition side, U.S. Code 2384, which reads, if two or more persons in any state or territory or in any place subject to the jurisdiction of the United States conspire to overthrow, put down, or to destroy by force the government of the United States, or to levy war against them, or to oppose by force the authority thereof, and by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States, or by force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States, contrary to the authority thereof, they shall each be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years, or both. So that's sedition. So let's talk about some of the folks that the Twitter sphere has been threatening or throwing these terms around about. So Lauren Boebert allegedly took part in a recon operation a day before the insurrection. And while Representative Mikey Sherrill of New Jersey has not specifically named her, it's like the worst kept secret on the Hill that that's who she means. So, and there have been videos that emerge of Congressman Boebert's mom with a megaphone shouting directions through a broken window to some of the insurrectionists on, okay, go through that door and then the second door on the right. And so she demonstrates some savvy about the layout of the Capitol. So let's imagine that recon or that investigation into her recon results in connecting the dots. So what's the burden of proof? What's the standard? What would she be accused of? And if found guilty of reconning the Capitol, inviting insurrectionists, hate groups on a tour so that they could eyeball where they wanted to go once they breached the Capitol doors. And remember, ultimately, 6 people have died as a result of the insurrection. One day of, others in the hospital, and there have been a number of suicides of law enforcement officers in the wake of the insurrection. So there have been some pretty dire consequences for these actions. But again, what would Boebert say her motivation was? Yeah, I gave him a tour. Maybe I knew that they were going to try to disrupt the proceedings, the joint session of Congress. But I never wanted anybody to die. And once they stopped it, that was going to be it. That was the end of our protest. So I don't know how you would prove without some sort of paper trail, and maybe this would emerge, that Boebert was guilty of treason. So the other thing about expulsion versus censure, so the burden or the votes required to expel somebody is a 2/3 majority. For censure, it's just a simple majority. So in the House, as we do the math, in order to have a 2/3 majority, you need roughly 287 votes. So that's 66 more than the Democrats have. So just think about how the impeachment vote went and how attitudes are currently in the House. It looks like GOP members are getting more and more MAGA-esque, maybe even QAnon-esque, and that's yesterday's episode about how the trend is not away from Trump. So for Democrats to woo 66 people across the aisle to have a 2/3 vote, I'm saying is probably a non-starter, unless the findings of this investigation to Boebert's actions are just so watertight and so egregious as to rise to the level of treason, or maybe even sedition. So think what could happen if you connect, if Mikey Sherrill is successful in connecting the dots and assigning a motive that is nefarious and in support of an insurrection, never mind what the end state was or the planned end state was, then perhaps you can censure her. Okay, so who's the next one? Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's become the Antichrist, and deservedly so, in the Twitter sphere. So a lot of social media activity is emerging of her talking about mentally retarded people and hounding the Parkland survivor students who are walking around the Hill trying to get legislation to prevent future school shootings. I mean, she's really a Karen to the worst degree here. She supports QAnon, so I guess that means she thinks that Oprah Winfrey is a cannibal and that Joe Biden is a pedophile and all the other stuff. Not to mention, she believes that the election was stolen, that Donald Trump won by a landslide. So she's now on the Education Committee. So a lot of people are trying to stymie her under the auspices of she should be censured because of her behavior. So as you reverse engineer her acts against charges that merit expulsion, I'm saying at this point, I'm not seeing anything that would result in her expulsion. Again, you need a 2/3 vote to expel a congressman, and I'm saying that's not happening. So let's say Pelosi, who has said her Greens acts are revolting and beyond the pale and some other words, let's say that she leads an effort to censure her. So remember, to censure a congressman, all you need is a simple majority. They've got a simple majority. So I'm thinking that could happen. So Boebert could get censured, Greene could get censured. That'll probably do it in the House. Now on the Senate side, the two poster children for accountability, using the AOC term, are Cruz and Hawley. We've talked about both those guys in great detail in recent episodes. Both of those guys were too cute by half with their manipulation of the rules and the processes of the Constitution. Both of them said, hey, I was just trying to apply with the Constitution when I objected to the vote. And when I demanded that there be the creation of Electoral College Commission, knowing full well that they were lighting the fire under an insurrection, as AOC accused Cruz in one of her tweets. I think that's not a leap in logic to make that accusation. So as we looked at the history of senators being expelled, the reasons are basically treason or joining the Confederacy at the outset of the Civil War. So my guess at this point, based on the evidence, that neither Hawley nor Cruz would be expelled because of their actions. Because with a straight face, and we've already seen them do it. You know, Hawley took to the pages of the New York Post saying, hey, I'm just trying to be, a good lawmaker here and support my constituents and follow the Constitution. I mean, he said that with a straight face, right? He's like, I'm being muzzled. So never mind these guys didn't read the room or willfully were cynical and mendacious. Never mind that they had no evidence to support their claims that the election was stolen or that it was improperly conducted. Remember, Hawley from Missouri had a grievance against the state of Pennsylvania for how they conducted their election. Based on what? Because that particular election went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looked at the lack of evidence and the fact it was based on conspiracy theories and said, we're not even going to hear it. So, as I've said before, Cruz and Hawley were cynical and disingenuous with we're just trying to comply with the Constitution. You could say they very much accelerated the angry mob with their acts. And, I showed the picture of Hawley walking in with the power fist on his way in. That's a good element of inciting the insurrection. But will that rise to the level of being expelled? I don't think so. It could rise to the level. Again, simple majority is all that it takes. And now the Democrats have a simple majority in the Senate. So whatever we're going to do, let's get to it. The impeachment is looking to be a big flat nothing in terms of actually convicting Trump. So let's get that behind us. And then this other high school cafeteria food fight stuff, let's, fish or cut bait. So if you have evidence that somebody did a recon and their expressed intent was to effect an insurrection, then go for it. Let's get it done. Let's censure the guilty parties and then get on with the business. Like Chip Roy said, we didn't send all these people to Congress to have them have Twitter battles. We got a lot of important stuff, starting with COVID, that needs to be solved so we can get back to having a normal existence. So, in the meantime, the American people could say that they deserve better, but maybe we're actually getting what we deserve in terms of how Congress is behaving. And in that case, we have some work to do in terms of our responsibility as members of a democracy. So maybe we should take a strain on that front. All right, that'll do it for this episode. As always, thank you for subscribing and sharing and commenting and liking. I look forward to talking to you again soon.